you, Madam Speaker. I rise today to speak to a question I raised in this House back in the spring session. And when I raised it, I was talking again about government debt. It was shortly after the budget was delivered here, and the government issued more debt and extended the debt it was going to visit upon Canadians here. And I asked that because the Office of the Superintendent of Financial Institutions talked about follow-on risks from the added debt the government was bringing into the financial equation for Canadians here. Those follow-on risks include things like stress in the mortgage insurance industry, investment portfolio risk, asset management risk, and insurance risk. Now, these are things the government doesn't have their eyes on when they're looking at just loading on more and more money to it. They keep extending the balance sheet, not just of the government, but also of its crown corporations. The Bank of Canada's balance sheet is expanding its liabilities. The Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporations expanding their balance sheet with more liabilities. This is more risk for Canadians, and that risk is borne in higher costs throughout the financial system, and Canadians eventually bear that. They bear that because this government actually just manages Canadians' money. It pulls in that money. No wonder they're raising taxes, because there's more bills to pay. And the primary part of that bill, of course, is rising, ever-rising interest on the debt that they are incurring here. This is a house of cards. And at the time I stated this finance minister needed to do a redo on the budget because, frankly, it is not delivering for Canadians, and it is spending way beyond our means and loading a whole bunch of burden onto future Canadian taxpayers. Now, the Parliamentary Secretary at that point in time, his response to me was, it's a hard time for Canadians. But then he tried to blame rising mortgage costs on Conservatives, as if we've been in government here causing all of this mayhem that's happening in the Canadian financial system. I'm going to go back to the Prime Minister's quote years ago, where he talked about the Canadian government's going to take on a whole bunch of debt so Canadians themselves don't have to. Well, the issue is both have happened. This government's debt to GDP ratio now is 107%. It's referenced in the International Monetary Fund's own disclosure documents, which I referred to last week in a previous session here, Madam Speaker. That amount is excessive, and recognize how high that is. But the Parliamentary Secretary last week tried to tell me that it's only 40%. It was frankly misinformation that is in their own government documents and exists nowhere else in the world. Government debt in Canada is 107% of our GDP, and they can reference that. Canadians can reference that anytime they want. Add to that the Canadian debt that's held by the public themselves, and that's about 102% of GDP. So if the government debt all in is $2.1 trillion, that's counting both provincial and federal debt, and the Canadian consumer debt is about $2.5 trillion, we are talking about a massive 209% minimum debt to GDP ratio in this country. There is no other country in the world, frankly, with such an offside, both on the consumer side and on the government side. So this whole thing about issuing debt for the benefit of Canadians, when they're also incurring a whole bunch of debt, is only layering on. Let's talk about that cost of debt. How much time do I have, Madam Speaker? 20 seconds. We'll get back to the cost of this in a little bit here, but I'd like to hear what my colleague across the way has to say about that. How are they going to actually manage this debt and actually get things under control? Thank you.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Innovation, Science and Industry.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker, and thanks to the Honourable Member for this question. I do appreciate him asking a thoughtful question. So our government certainly continues to manage responsibly Canada's public finances. I know the member opposite seems to disagree with that, but he should remember that our debt service costs are the lowest in the G7 when compared to GDP. As a percentage of GDP, they're at 0.6% of GDP is the cost to service the national debt. Also, the International Monetary Fund, contrary to what the member has said, has rated Canada #1 in the world in terms of budget balance, and also gives Canada a #1 ranking in the G7 to have the largest GDP growth in 2025. So in fact, Canada has done fairly well. in the grand scheme of things. Certainly the COVID-19 pandemic had a massive impact on the world economy, lots of losses of revenue, lots of interruptions to supply chains. Certainly was one of the biggest economic dips one could see, probably in our, at least in the last 100 years. And we've recovered quite quickly from that, which is good news for Canadians. And our government is quite proud of our record in terms of our support to Canadians during that time, which has allowed us to recover quickly. Some of that debt, obviously, Canada now services, but at a much lower rate and with a AAA credit rating, which we've maintained. We also know that Canada is leading the G7 in achieving a soft landing from the post-pandemic surge in inflation and high interest rates. The Bank of Canada was the first central bank in the G7 to cut interest rates since the recent global hiking cycle, and first to cut it twice, and first to cut it a third time. This is something that I think all Canadians should perceive, and certainly the member opposite should perceive and admit is a very positive sign for Canada's recovery post-pandemic, that we're the first country to do not one, not two, but 3 rate cuts with our central bank, that the Bank of Canada has said that Canada has stuck to its fiscal guardrails that were set out in last year's fall economic statement, that the budget stuck to those fiscal guardrails was exactly why that inflationary pressures were alleviated from the economy, that the government had managed to its resources in such a way as to ensure that those interest rates could start to come down faster and more quickly. This is helping people who have a mortgage coming up for renewal. It's helping people with variable rate mortgages immediately. It's helping people looking to buy a first home. This is helping business owners from coast to coast to coast that may be carrying debt. Interest rates are falling because inflation has come down. It's come down for many months in a row, from over 8% to now 2%, which is right at the Bank of Canada's target rate. So this is good news for Canadians. It really is good news. Things are looking up. Canada's economy is recovering. And I know that the member opposite and I can debate fiercely, but I think the facts speak for themselves. And when you have independent rating agencies, the independent Bank of Canada governor, you have even our parliamentary budget officer recently came out with a report that showcased that Canada could, he actually said Canada could spend over $40 billion more per year. That's not the intention of this government, of course, but it was interesting to hear the parliamentary budget officer who independently has said that there's actually fiscal room there, but to hear these independent experts actually say that our government has stuck
the honourable member for the Calgary Centre.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker. And there was a whole bunch of misinformation. There were some facts in there, but there was a whole bunch of fiction as well. And I'll go through some of that. Number one, the OECD has Canada being one of the worst performing economies over the next decade. And you can reference that when he talked about the IMF's status about how our Canada sits. It was a complete misleading this House and misleading Canadians. And frankly, we've had enough of it. But let's look at the rising cost of debt in Canada, because that's what matters. The rising cost of debt, Canadians have about $5,600 of debt payments between what governments pay and what they have to pay themselves. That's about $14,000 per household. After tax, if you think about it, an average salary in Canada is $60,000. Average tax after that, $120,000 if you do it by 2, $14,000 is 20% of some people's income. Can he explain how he's going to get that rate down? Thank you very much, Madam Speaker.
Parliamentary Secretary.
Madam Speaker, I'm proud of our government's track record on managing the resources of this country in a way that's responsible and stewarding our country through some of very challenging economic times. Again, I don't need to remind the member, but I will anyways, because I think he's got amnesia when it comes to understanding the economic impacts of a global pandemic, which was a once-in-a-100-year public health crisis. I know that he wants to conveniently forget about the fact that the rest of the world is dealing with the inflationary pressures that Canada has been dealing with. Canada has fared much better than many other peer countries around the world. We've had inflation come down to the Bank of Canada's target rate. We've stuck to our fiscal guardrails. The IMF has rated Canada #1 in terms of budget balance and #1 when it comes to GDP growth in the year 2025, which is next year. Canada is faring very well. We have the highest per capita foreign direct investment. We've recovered over 2 million jobs from the post-pandemic recovery. Canada is, things are looking bright for this country. Thank you.